ACCA, Developing Professional Accountants.
We now wish to look at a topic called absorption costing. Absorption costing is one of the two fundamental or generic costing methodologies in cost accounting. The other, for your interest, and we'll be talking about it later in the syllabus, is marginal costing. So what is absorption costing all about? Well, in very simple terms, all we're trying to do is to establish a full cost per unit. What does that mean? Well, what we're trying to do is to link all the costs, let's say within a manufacturing or production environment, with the end product. Quite often we only talk about full production cost per unit, but we may need full cost including all costs, production costs and administrative costs. Why do we need a cost per unit? Well, something in a moment we're going to look at is exactly that fact. What are the basic uses of absorption costing? Once we've dealt with that, we will focus on the key issue with absorption costing, which relates to overheads, whatever they may be. Then we, of course, have the methodology of how it works. And then finally, what are the limitations? Now, I must emphasize that I am focusing on looking at absorption costing here solely from the perspective of F5. That means I will not be going into any of the detail in absorption costing that you may have seen in previous studies, but is not relevant to an exam question in F5. As I said a moment ago, the fundamental aim is to calculate a full production cost per unit, full cost per unit. That means that we've got to link all the costs to the product. Now, of course, some costs are very easy to link to the product. For example, materials that go into the product can be measured very accurately. You also may be able to measure maybe labour content also to the product. The big issue with regard to absorption costing is not with materials and labour, say, because they're going to be easy. They are what we describe as direct costs. The big problem are all those other costs incurred in a manufacturing process, which are necessarily indirect. And what I mean by indirect is that there is no obvious link between incurring the cost on the one hand and producing the product on the other hand. These indirect costs are called overheads, and the overheads are what absorption costing from a computational perspective is all about. So what we're aiming to do is we're aiming to link all the direct costs, the easy ones, to the product, that's not a problem, but also link all the overheads to the product as well. And that's where the fun arises. Why do we need absorption costing? Well, to me, there are three basic uses of the full cost per unit that we calculate. Firstly, stock valuation. Now, please note that I don't really care about how I value my stock. The stock valuation bit there is for the financial accountant. So what we're saying here is that the fundamental reason why we are doing absorption costing is not for management accounting purposes, but instead for external reporting purposes. You know, the financial accountant is too lazy to do it himself. Bear that in mind when we talk later about other costing methodologies. In addition to stock valuation, we've got a couple of other ideas. Pricing decisions, maybe. What we may be doing is setting the cost and then adding a margin to get the price. Straightforward cost plus. There are certain circumstances, such as a job costing environment, where that is really the only simple way that we can establish a price. We may also use absorption costing, full cost per unit, within budgeting. But interestingly, when we look at budgeting, you know, the planning of the future, we could use absorption costing valued at full cost per unit Or we could use marginal costing, and that's something we talk about later. So these are our basic uses. What I have here is an illustrative example of how absorption costing works. If we look at the bottom, what we notice is that the direct costs, because of their direct nature, can easily be linked to the cost unit. Job done. Very straightforward, no problem there at all. Copy it out of the question and throw it in the answer. The fun, the entertainment arises with the overhead costs. Remember, we said that they were indirect. There was no obvious link between the overhead costs and the product or cost unit. As such, we've got to find some way of linking those costs to the cost unit. The way we do this is by introducing a halfway house called a cost centre. Now, this cost centre is, well, it could be a whole host of different things. It could be a function such as a manager or a machine or a region or a location. But typically, you tend to talk about departments. Department A, Department B, production department, service department, that sort of thing. So we have our halfway house, the cost centre. And this is simply here to make it possible to link those indirect costs to the product in some sensible manner. Now, when we're dealing with the direct costs, what we're able to do is to allocate the direct costs. What I mean by that is we're able to allocate them accurately. We know with certainty where the costs are incurred. Okay? But when it comes to the overhead costs, what we have are two steps. Firstly, we apportion the costs to the cost centre. Most of the costs will have to be spread in some fair way across all the cost centres. Now, there's no right or wrong answer here. Apportionment essentially is educated guesswork. A classic example would be building costs, you know, the costs of maintaining the building, may be spread on floor area. It's fair. Is it accurate? We don't know. It's that sort of thing. And once we've got all of the costs in the cost centres, then what we do is we absorb from the cost centres to the cost unit. Now, just from the perspective of F5, can I just say this? Although apportionment can be very entertaining, there could be lots and lots of numbers flying around there, this sort of thing tends not to be examined at F5. So what we tend to be given is information where we already know the costs within cost centres. And as such, we only need to do that second step to get from the cost centre to the cost unit. Okay? So, if we can allocate accurately our direct costs and we can absorb our indirect costs, hey presto abracadabra, we have our full cost per unit, including all the costs going into producing that product. Well, okay, let's look at a question. What we have here is a very simple question. Do you remember, I'm not interested that much in this topic. I'm only interested in it in passing because it may impact on other topics that we're dealing with. So we've got 2P2D, which produces two products in two departments, and it has the following relevant product information. So we have our direct material cost and our direct labour cost. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm looking at this, and the whole point about direct cost is that they are not difficult. I pick them out of the question and I throw them in the answer. It's not going to be difficult at all. Okay? Moving on. Oh, we have direct labour costs in Department Y. That's very helpful. We're also given time per unit in Department X and time per unit in Department Y. We're then given the budgeted number of units, fine. The labour rate is £5 per hour. And then we're given the budgeted departmental overhead at the bottom. Now, I don't know about you, but if I want to get a full cost per unit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to include those numbers, the direct costs, and these numbers, oh sorry, missed that direct cost there, and these numbers at the bottom. The direct costs at the top are going to go straight into our answer. There's no issue, no problem there. The fun, the entertainment bit, is going to be relating to how do we deal with this bit here? How do we absorb or link the overhead to the product in some fair way? Well, okay. If we look at the answer, as I said, we've got our direct costs there. That's very straightforward. And that was done without thinking, thoughtlessly. The key is how we deal with the overheads. And what I've got here is a little working. Now, if we go back to the question for a moment, let's just have a look at what the question says. We've got to find some way of linking that overhead, that total amount of overhead, to the product. Now, we don't know how the overhead is incurred, so we've got to make some best guess of how we may link it. Now, there are two basic methodologies that you may adopt. One would be to spread the cost over the number of units. You know, if you look here, we've got what? 2,000 of A and 1,000 of B, 3,000 units. We could just spread the overhead over the units. But of course, this really only makes sense if the units are similar in size, yes, and similar in value. So we don't normally do that. We need some other bases to link our overheads. And the way it works is this. The assumption is that these costs down here are period costs, costs incurred over time. And if they are period costs, costs incurred over time, then it makes sense to absorb them, to link them to the product over the time that they take to be incurred. That's the basic logic. So, don't worry too much about that. That simply means that in these questions, if you're doing absorption costing, it is very likely that you are going to use machine hours or labour hours, measures of time. And what do we have here? Well, interestingly, we're given hours without being told whether they're machine or labour. I am guessing they are labour because they tally very nicely with those direct labour costs. Okay, so how do we go about this? Well, let's look at... Should we just go back to the how we go about it? So, how do we go about this? Well, what we need is something called an overhead absorption rate. So let's see how that is calculated. Now, an overhead absorption rate, or as I write it, OAR, is where we take the budgeted overhead cost divided through by the budgeted level of activity, L of A. Level of activity. And as I said to you, we want hours here. So, I've got a couple of calculations below, but just maybe to prove them, because I know that you don't trust me, I think we know where the 18,000 comes from. That's the budgeted overhead cost. But let's just check this 14,000 hours. How many hours were worked in Department X? Well, if we go back to the question, what we can see when we look at the hours here is that Department X has got 4 hours for product A, and that's 2,000 units, and 6 hours for product B, and that's 1,000 units. Now, I don't know about you, I've got ropey mathematics here, but I reckon there's 8,000 hours for product A, 6,000 hours for product B, add them together. Phew, that comes to the number that we thought of. So, what have we done here? what we've managed to do is to get our overhead absorption rates. That is a rate per hour, a rate per labour hour. Once we have that rate for the department as a whole, then what we can do is apply it to the individual products to absorb the overhead to the products. So if we were to look at the individual products, let's just pick this little chappy here. We were told that the rate was £1.29 per hour. And of course, how many hours were worked on one unit of product A within Department X? Well, 4 hours. So in simple terms, 4 hours at £1.29 an hour is going to give us £5.20, give or take a rounding error. So that's the way that we go about things. And you may have noticed I'm not very excited about absorption costing. It's very difficult to get excited about absorption costing. But these are the basic mechanics that you have to be able to do. If you haven't come across absorption costing again, I must ask you to work through this question methodically, step by step on your own. That means I want you to first of all copy across your direct costs, easy peasy. Once you've done that, you then calculate the overhead absorption rate for each product. Not a problem. And once you've got your overhead absorption rate for each product, then you link the overhead to the products. Absorption costing is a fundamental, generic methodology. It's been around since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and therefore it's had some staying power. And remember, the very important aspect of absorption costing is that regardless of whether we, as management accountants, want it, the financial accountants need this information, the full cost per unit, in order that they can have stock valuation and cost of sales valuations in their external reports. But there are limitations associated with the use of absorption costing. Firstly, and probably most importantly, the arbitrary nature of apportionment. Remember, we do not know for certain where these costs are incurred. We simply find some fair way of spreading costs across cost centres. Because it's guesswork, the more complex an environment becomes, the less likely that guesswork is going to lead to an accurate, correct cost per unit. Secondly, absorption bases are volume-based. What we've just seen, you know, we absorb based on labour hours or machine hours. You see, the issue with this is that we do not know, again, whether volume, just basic volume, is the thing that incurs cost. And again, as production processes become more complex, it becomes less and less possible to defend the use of just labour hours or machine hours as a means of linking overhead costs to the products. And of course, this leads to the big problem. Those top two lead to the fact that product costs are likely to be inaccurate. Because they're based on guesses, because they're based on volume computations and nothing else. If you have a multi-product environment which has quite complex processes, it is likely that some of your products are going to be quite heavily overcosted, charged too much, and some are going to be undercosted, charged too little, which could be very problematic when it comes to deciding whether the products are good or bad, successful or otherwise. And as a result of this, I am not very happy as a management accountant in using this particular methodology for things that I want to use it for. Budgeting, pricing, any form of decision making. So, if we look at absorption costing, we know that everybody uses it, but at the same stage we're not particularly happy with its use. In summary for absorption costing, It's assumed knowledge from the F2 syllabus. I've told you what you need to know and no more, because anybody who's done F2 or any other paper like that will appreciate that there's quite a lot more complexity that we tend to ignore given that we've moved on to F5. The reason why we need it is that it's used elsewhere. Basic absorption costing techniques will be used a number of times in a number of different areas of the syllabus. Make sure you're able to do the basic computation I've shown you.